All right. Hello and welcome once again to White Lotus of Light conversational series. And this is part two of my conversation with Mark Stavish. And you can go back and watch part one. Part two probably will stand on its own, but I highly recommend you go back and watch part one. Mark hit on some really amazing stuff, especially at the conclusion, that I highly recommend all of my viewers take the time to especially watch that last section with the first in the first half. And so, Mark, I want to ask you some questions now that are going to be a little more, I don't know, loose and not necessarily strictly on the egregores, although we did wander a bit off that at the end of the last one, which was actually fantastic and a huge, I think, blessing for everyone to hear. I do want to ask, though, a couple more follow-ups on the egregores, and that is, I heard in one of your other interviews this idea that egregores can reach through or influence artificial intelligence and machines. And I feel a little bit funny to even ask this question given the end of the last interview. But do you think, I've heard people say that boy, I almost don't know, even want to say it after the end of like what we just finished with part one, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. I've heard people theorize that there's this concept of Rudolf Steiner of how there's this aramonic force, this materializing force, an energy that is hostile to humanity, and there are some people who theorize that the way in which this aramonic force or this antichrist force would manifest is through these like D-wave computers, some of these quantum computers, some of these super advanced computers and artificial intelligence. And I just am curious, what are your thoughts on the way that egregores might interface with AI and or these really advanced computers that people have? And viewers, please go back and listen to the end of part one and you'll understand why I'm chuckling about asking this question, which I had written down prior to conversing with Mark in part one.
Well, I think that there's several technical aspects to that question.
Mm-hmm.
One is what we're talking about is really where does the physical dimension begin and end?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really end. And this is the problem. Many people don't understand that. And just because your sensory realization of it ends,
Mm-hmm.
and just because we create devices that allow for the extension of the senses, whether it be eyeglasses or microscopes or satellites in space, within different systems of thought, even the spiritual dimension, which we think of as not physical, is really considered physical in the sense that it has its own dimensions, its own rules, but it's duality. Do you understand that? It's still duality. So even the most subtle of energy at that dimension is still existing in the domain of duality. So when we look at our mind, you have to understand, and this is very critical for you and all of your listeners, your thoughts are always in what we in Kabbalah would call Yesod. Where do your thoughts come from right now? Find them, trace them back. How is it that I'm able to sit here with you and have a coherent conversation? I'm not aware of what I'm going to say next, but somehow I managed to say something relatively coherent.
Right.
Okay. So your thoughts in that way are always in the psychic dimension. Always. They can be nowhere else. But that psychic dimension is not separate from physical reality. It's a gradation, a spectrum of very dense to increasingly subtle to extremely subtle energetic frequencies that our consciousness rides up and down at different ways. So when we look at paranormal phenomena, we're looking at a manipulation of that spectrum of energy. So what is the most paranormal thing we do every day? Well, we get up and we get out of bed. I mean, that's psychokinesis at its finest. We really don't know how the mind interacts with the nervous system to make the body move the way we do.
Mm-hmm.
So if one has a certain capacity to move their mind, that is, and with it energy, into something else, whether that be a talisman, an amulet, blessed water, or healing through Reiki or something like that, what's to say it can't move it into a machine? Now, what would the advantages be? Well, it depends on what is the outcome you're after. What is the outcome you desire? And of course, the machine has its own programming too and limitations. So you're not going to be able to make it do something that it can't do any more than you're going to be able to make a dog talk. You have to deal with certain real limits.
Mm-hmm.
So some schools of thought have a certain belief, and you see this in Taoism and others because of the use of mirrors in magical practices and visionary practices, that they are a gateway. Well, they are a gateway, but they'll often keep them covered for that reason. I don't know if that's necessarily essential, but out of habit, I've always done that out of habit and training. But I don't think it's really essential. Now, what is this television screen? But in a way, it's just a big mirror, a big black mirror on your wall or on your screen. And what does it do? It sucks you into its reality, which you do have choice. It has its own certain intelligences, known as programming and algorithms that make suggested viewing to you.
Mm-hmm.
So your question is, at what point is this intelligence something other than human directed? Well, it goes back to what you want to believe. Now, Steiner gave an interesting model. Now, the problem with Steiner is that it's Steiner and he can be hard to understand.
Mm-hmm.
But he does present an interesting model in which you have these highly emotional energies, which he calls Lucifer on one hand, quite literally on one side of the scale.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have these incredibly intellectual and dry and mechanical energies of Ahriman on the other side of the scale. And he has Christ as the perfect man, the perfect being, in between them, not excluding them, but harmonizing them. Because we're complex beings. And in most spiritual systems, I have to tell you, it's far easier to deal with someone who is, or get them at least moving in a direction who has some juice, some emotions, than someone who doesn't. Because energy, emotions is the juice, it's the energy of the practice. That's why devotional practices are so important, particularly now. If someone doesn't know what to do, just do a devotional practice. Find a deity that has a good ideal for you. This is an ideal that you want to follow, and you want to incarnate into your life with a strength, courage, creativity, enlightenment, all of those things, meditational practice, and do that. That's what the entire Catholic Rosary is based upon. That's what many of the most popular Tibetan and Hindu practices are based upon. So that's very useful. Ahriman, of course, is his dry mechanical function of life, which is incredibly materialistic. It's essentially atheism. And we see atheism in many forms today. We see it's very popular. And when I say atheism, I don't mean like Buddhist atheism, which is a metaphysical atheism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean an atheism which pretty much says, and even brilliant people talk about the problems today who are atheists, that the physical world is pretty much the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
That they don't really believe that there's any consciousness that survives after death in any form. Therefore, consciousness is a byproduct of whatever material energies come about. Now, there's some truth to that, that our awareness is a product of our sensory input. We become aware of things because of stimulation, but how we process that information is what gives us knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And knowledge, as it grows, is what we can then apply to find enlightenment. So there's steps along the way. But I wouldn't say that our consciousness is first according to the esoteric systems, and matter extends from it, and then a feedback loop develops. It's not matter and then consciousness. Okay. So when we look at mechanical life today, we have to look at it and say, is this serving us or are we serving it? And that's where the Amish come in. The Amish, and of course the Mennonites, are very popular among people who know really nothing about them, because they have this fantastic ideal of them, back to the land and all of that. But one of the more interesting aspects of I believe it's Old Order Amish, is that they don't own anything they can't fix. And I think certain Mennonites will say, okay, so we can have tractors, but the tires are metal because we can fix metal tires rather than rubber tires. We have to replace them. And of course, people are familiar with the idea of the phone, and the phone is in a phone booth outside the house, so it's not too convenient to use, and that kind of thing. So often we look at our technology and we find that we are possessed by it, we are owned by it, rather than us owning it. So again, that goes back to the first part of the discussion about why having your own dedicated path, dedicated practice under some guidance that can move you in a direction is very helpful.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask, and this kind of relates to the whole thing that we talked about in part one, and there's a specific reason I'm asking this, just because I've had an experience, both witnessed it in others and also experienced it even within myself, and it points very much to the danger that we talk about in part one of our conversation. I talked about, is there any value to this, trying to understand what's going on politically, and like that there's darker agendas, and that there's perhaps groups of people that don't have your best interests at heart, whether you want to call them Madison Avenue advertising executives and people at Tavistock, who are trying to manipulate people psychologically, or you want to take it as, somewhere else like dark magicians, what have you. I asked, was there any value in trying to alert people to perhaps unfolding political disasters or whatever that are caused by these actors, of however you want to visualize them? And you said pretty definitively, no, there is not, because actually you are empowering that by interacting with and trying to understand that. And an example of this that I have witnessed myself, that I have even experienced within myself, when I was sort of earlier on in trying to understand the historical grounding of some of these political forces, there was a point in my research I eventually came to conclude that actually, no, it was more likely the self-proclaimed Venetian black nobility who was kind of like pulling the strings to the largest degree of any group. But there was a point where I was, sort of like, wow, I can't not notice that there is a large hand among Jewish people in some of these groups. And I then became, until I could break that and kind of see this European blue blood group even behind that was using these Jewish people, for about a 600-year period as frontmen for their machinations, I found myself getting not just intellectually obsessed with the fact that there was Jewish people involved, but straight up possessed. Now, mind you, my son is of Jewish descent. He's not Jewish because his mother's father was Jewish, but not her mother, and so therefore, from the matrilineal sense, not Jewish. And I'm bringing this up simply because when I was sort of in the grip of this, I was married to a woman who very much looks Jewish, who I was very much in love with, who was the mother of my son, whose father was Jewish. I had and continue to have many, many very close, intimate friends who are Jewish. And yet I would find that when I would just talk about the political aspects of where there are Jewish actors involved, I would have this intense emotional response that was way above and beyond the information that I was reading about, to where it felt I would have an anger and even like a hate would start to seep in. And I was like, what is going on? Like, what's going on with my body? What's going on with my emotional response here? This isn't normal. This doesn't feel like when I'm talking about, say, the Bush family or whatever other group. This feels different. And I have noticed that as I've tried to explain people some of these historical roots and talking about what I just said with the European blue bloods and the Venetian black nobility in particular, that I would have people get really aggressive and angry with me because I wasn't blaming Jewish people exclusively. And I was a race traitor, or I was saying, I was muddying the waters, which just helped the predatory Jewish people like attack us and so forth. And what I realized was, because I had read your book by this point, that there seemed to be a anti-Semitic egregore, an egregore that was built around specifically, people don't like that term, but hating Jewish people, I guess, is the best way of describing it. And I realized that there's a anti-Islamic egregore, and there's an anti-Catholic egregore, and there's almost
the nature of duality is that there's both a for and against of different things, right. And doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just simply means they're distorted. I mean, having dealt with a variety of different people across the board in different situations, there has to be a little bit of truth to everything, otherwise it doesn't stick. The point is, it's not the whole truth.
Right.
So you're fed again a caricature.
Right.
The reality is, you have to learn to read the energy of a situation. Now, I did two interviews with Peter Mark Adams. They're on the Institute for Hermetic Studies YouTube page, where we talk about his book on the Solibus Scotero. Okay. And what makes that most interesting is the Game of Saturn is the name of his book. We talk about the survival of some very questionable magical operations in the Renaissance. Now, so what? You're not going to stop that. You don't have the capacity. And you don't have the capacity to wake anyone up, except to the degree that you are awake. So, you can point out a problem, but you don't have a solution. So you're useless. Or worse, you're a distraction because you're pointing problems at the people. They get all upset about it, but they don't know what to do. So we have to bring people solutions.
Yes.
And the solution is, there are problems in the world. There are problems in your life. If you can manage the problems in your life, you're going to get more responsibility to manage bigger problems in the world if you choose that. Okay. So if you choose that, that's going to be a path you take. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to your capacity. And your capacity is based on your own inner awakening.
Yes.
So it always comes back to you. So is it useful to tell people about these things? Only to the degree that you can offer a solution or a path, an alternative. If you can't offer it, it's the same as telling a lie. Why? Why tell them? It doesn't do them any good. And in fact, it injures your reputation and it injures your standing in that community, in that group. Silence is sometimes the better part of valor, which is the virtue of Saturn. You have to learn silence. When is the time to speak? When Jesus said, go into the town, preach the gospel. If they don't want to listen, leave. He didn't say sit there and beat their head, beat them over the head with it. And this is what fundamentalists do. Whether it's a fundamentalist Christian doing the gospel thing, whether it's a fundamentalist Muslim, or whether it's a fundamentalist New Age or conspiracy person.
Right.
They beat it over your head, and they have no credibility. Because it's not about them. It's not about you coming to the realization. It's about them telling you, them helping you, them bringing you to the faith. Well, there's no salvation in that faith. There's no salvation.
Wow. That's super well put.
And
Yeah.
so,
Oh, go ahead.
it's only despair. I
Yeah.
mean, that's the reality. That's what I said. People who are involved in this have to stop serving the thing that they think they're fighting. They're not. You're serving it. You are bringing nothing but despair to people because you have nothing else to offer. But
Hmm.
what you have to do is offer, look, the world isn't always the way we see it and believe it to be. That's okay. We can be, there's a lot of things we'll never be sure of. See, the problem with conspiracy theories is that conspiracies are real. I say that all the time. You know, the folks who organized the Swansea conference in 1942 knew what they were doing. They redacted the minutes. They knew what they were talking about. It was the mass murder of, well, as many millions of people as they could get. It climbed upward to about 12 to 15 million.
What group was that? I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Well, that was the Swansea conference. That was the official organization of the final solution.
Ah, yeah.
You see, you have to know these things. You have to know history,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
not just what people tell you in their podcasts or books.
Mm-hmm.
So when you know that, okay, these things take place. We know that, the CIA has been involved in overthrowing governments. We know that. We know the KGB's been involved in overthrowing governments. This is nothing new.
Right.
The question is, now that I know this, how
Mm-hmm.
do I go about my day and how do I go about my actions in the world?
Mm-hmm.
Is it helping me or hindering me?
Yeah.
So we have to say, okay, well, as I said to someone on an interview the other night, we are 60 years this month out from the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's 2 Saturn returns for those who follow astrology. That's very important. Astrology indicates, it does not determine.
Right.
So now, while we recognize that there's never been a nuclear war or the use of nuclear weapons in war since 1945, the possible use of them is not zero. And the reason it's not zero is because they exist. It's that simple. So if you want to focus your attention on something, focus your attention on how do we create an atmosphere of general well-being so that we can encourage the at least de-escalation of militarization and the elimination of these weapons of mass destruction. That's a good use. Now, focusing on de-escalation and demilitarization is not a positive end in and of itself, because then you're constantly focused on the enemy. One of the problems with the anti-war movement is that when the Vietnam War ended, they didn't know what to do because they were anti-war.
Mm.
How do you promote attitudes and conditions for peace and well-being, in general well-being? Peace is not a static state, as much as we like to think it is. That is, as long as we're here in this world, it's going to ebb and flow. That's the nature of our existence. But how do we encourage kindness, generosity, well-being, and courage? How do we do that? And with that, problem solving. Because you want to be concerned about something. Don't be concerned about some dark Illuminati you can't find. Be concerned about the fact that in Europe, they have tremendous power shortages.
Right.
And, nuclear power plants need to be decommissioned, and that's not easy to do. And that takes energy off the grid. So what do you do now when you don't have your energy sources coming in and you've decommissioned your nuclear? Where are you going to get your energy from? Now, of course, they've opened some new pipelines, but it's still going to be very expensive for a lot of people, and it's going to be a crushing, horrible winter for them. That's more of a reality that you can try and focus on and do something about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And as long as we have nuclear plants and nuclear weapons, that energy that Shakti, that prana, that needs to be dealt with in a safe manner.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's a reality that we can wrap our heads around and say, okay, and how do we do that? Well, we have to encourage peace, well-being, cooperation, all of these good qualities. But you can only encourage them when you bring them forth within yourself first.
Right.
You have to bring them forth and be an embodiment of them. You must be possessed by those qualities. You must open yourself up to be possessed by those qualities so that you embody them, so that they can spread forth and help lift things up and help lift up those around you and have that ripple effect. I caught part of a Jordan Peterson podcast, which was quite fascinating because I never thought about it this way. But each one of us has the capacity now with technology to reach maybe 1,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
And that means, that person has 1,000. So we're 2 people away from reaching like, 1 million or 1 billion people.
It's wild. Yeah.
That's why, and with this technology, so instead of looking at just what it does for us that is terrible, we can possess it. We can use it, and not to fight the Illuminati, not to fight the transhumanists,
Mm-hmm.
but to have a vision and encourage that vision of health and wellness and cooperation and general well-being and enlightenment, without necessarily saying exactly what that is, because it can be very different for others than it is for us.
Mm. That's super well said, and I think that's just like the end of part one, that's really the big takeaway of this conversation, and everything else is more intellectual philosophizing about interesting concepts. And I really do think that's what people need to take on board. However, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, another philosophizing question or two. And I want to end with asking you some questions about, or having you elaborate on your Hermetic Institute. And so just feel free to tell me when your time, because I know that we're getting near the end of the amount of time that you offered, which was very generous. So just please, I'm going to let you guide how much time we have. And when you're like, oh, we need to wrap up, I'll just ask that final question. So you sort of mentioned this a little bit at different points about how various different surfaces can act as psychic portals. But you mentioned sort of, and it's interesting, you called it a black mirror, because of course there's that sci-fi kind of like modern Twilight Zone show out of the BBC called The Black Mirror, which often is very, very dark dystopian stuff. But you've said that computer screens or television screens act as psychic portals, and this is somewhat drawn from ancient esoteric traditions, but there's also like a very real, very tangible aspect. As you said, people can watch television, they can be taken into a completely different world. When you say that, like, what is the functionality beyond the television analogy of the way in which, for example, people who are watching this show, like, how is it operating as a psychic portal in a concrete terms? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, most of these things for people exist on a mental level, and again, mental is psychic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not in the sense that we think of as physical. It's, again, where do our thoughts come from? It's just not as fully embodied
Mm-hmm.
as we think. So it offers a connection,
Mm-hmm.
and that in of itself is a psychic connection. It's
Mm-hmm.
mental. It's not physical. We're not in the same room together. But if we bring our imagination to it, if we bring our other potential to it, we can have a greater sense of presence.
Mm.
And many people, they get very, because the way their structure is, they can become very absorbed in what they're watching, and it can have not just a psychological, that is an emotional effect on them, but a physiological. As soon as you affect the emotions, you affect the physiology. It's just a matter of degree.
Mm.
So, our purpose here is to help people find out, yes, there are many things in the world you need to bear. Yes, it can be difficult. Yes, it is difficult. That's no different. Welcome to the world. Okay? You're in a far better place than most people if you're spending time on this podcast.
Yes.
So you look at what your strengths are and you move forward from there.
Mm. Mm. So I want to ask a somewhat silly question, but it is one that I've wondered about more and more on both a psychological level, but also on perhaps a deeper magical level. And this may come down to how one defines it, sort of a semantics thing, how one defines magic as in practical magic that has an influence either on one's own psychology or on the world in general. But there's a concept going around that the meme, right? These images usually with words attached to them, that there's something that people call meme magic, to where they have the belief that memes take on a life of their own, and that the degree to which they influence people is so extraordinary that it goes beyond even just like advertisements or that sort of thing, though it is very akin to that. I'm just curious, what are your opinions as someone who is, very well studied in esoteric and magical systems and so forth? What is your opinion on, does it fit the classical definition of magic, and how would you define magic, I guess? And then do you feel that memes, or perhaps some memes, the ones that go viral, do you consider them to be magic in the classic?
The important point is that we go back to what I said earlier, that our minds are always generating thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And those thoughts, depending on their intensity, which means emotional content,
Mm-hmm.
either become, we'll say, more potent or embodied, or they don't.
Mm-hmm.
So magic is never not happening. So when we even go to define it, we're trying to say this is it and this isn't. Now, if you look at Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, which are the foundation of most Western magical practices, you see that book 1 is concerned with those things which we would consider standard chemistry or physics to some degree. It is not concerned with this, what we think of as purely metaphysical or paranormal. That doesn't come in until book 2 and 3. So the notion that we consider something magical or not is part of the problem. It's what you have is the magical worldview, the worldview of what does it mean to have a world that you live in, which is to some greater or lesser degree. And I even have trouble with the word alive, where there's a continuity.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we plug into that continuity? How do we understand those different rates of vibration, and that those different rates of vibration are not inert, but carry with them an inherent intelligence, an inherent packet of information? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, yes, a meme is a magical operation, and it can maybe take on some temporary existence but then it dies away, it goes away. And that idea that it carries may reincarnate in some other form. But how much sentience it has is questionable. But it has an energy load, and an energy load then will have an impact on people to greater or lesser degree, and then someone may be inspired by it. And inspired, inhale to take in the God. Enthusiasm, the God is to indwell. Okay. Their enthusiasm, they are possessed temporarily by the ideal, and then they give it a new form, a new meme, and then it continues on, just as someone is radically and enthused over the beauty of their high school or college sweetheart, and ups, a new life takes its root and life goes forward.
Wow.
So it's not that complex. What we do is we make it more complex by trying to overly compartmentalize it rather than understand it.
Yeah.
So you start with continuum. Everything is on a continuum.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I especially like that analogy of the college sweetheart. So I want to ask sort of as a wrap-up question, then you can just sort of finish however you want. You run the I want to get the correct title here, the Institute for Hermetic Studies. Can you explain what that your organization does and how it might differ from classical magical schools or mystery schools? I read a bit of the description. I myself am intrigued, and we can talk about that off camera. But the way you describe it, it sounds that you are really trying to sort of differentiate yourself from any sort of mystery school, kind of like other magical organizations. And I'm just curious, how would you say that you might be similar or different from those?
Well, our structure is that we treat you as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to come in and take one of our classes, that's fine. You're free to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't offer degrees or initiations.
Right.
If you want to take a structured course of study, we'll help you with that. We'll tell you what courses to take and in what order.
Mm-hmm.
And you take them at your own pace. And again, it's like a college course. If you come to us for help, we're here. If you don't, we're not. You're responsible for your own becoming.
Mm-hmm.
We have some very good instructors, and we have study groups that people come to as a group for study, because we can't answer every individual email. So if you want to have questions answered, you come to the study session. Again, like school.
Mm-hmm.
People have these ideas about teachers, and they want these intense personal one-to-one relationships when they're not warranted or needed. You have to earn that. I mean, that's postgraduate work. Very rarely does an undergraduate have an intense personal relationship with an instructor or professor, unless they have shown exceptional quality. You don't have those relationships until you're in graduate school, and they're difficult. And it's the same way in spiritual practice. It is very difficult when you have that intensity. Most people aren't ready for it, nor do they really want it after it starts. So we give people the possibility of that, but more or less they go at their own pace. So you want to join, you want to take the class, that's wonderful. We'll help you. Here's what you do. So we cover traditional esotericism, and we cover some modern esotericism. It's aimed at providing you with the tools and the knowledge that you will need to be successful in that path. And that path is one primarily aimed at self-awakening. Okay, because once you get that, then you're able to solve your problems. And many of them simply disappear on their own too, as the psychological and psychic blocks. Karma is just another word for habit. When those psychic habits have disappeared, they no longer obstruct you. So the Institute has online programs at Teachable. We have a lot of printed or matter, so to speak, online articles at our website. But Teachable is where to go for the online courses. And our blog, Vox Hermes, has a lot of very useful information on it, a tremendous amount of useful information for someone. So we have something for almost everyone who would like to undertake this path, and a mechanism where they can meet up with others. We have an annual conference once a year.
Cool.
We have presenters, and that conference is also done virtually. So people who can't come in can participate via Zoom or some other mechanism. We also post it, so if people go to Teachable, they'll see 3 conferences posted. I think one of which is for free. Maybe the second one is, I don't remember. And then the third one, which is this year's, has a modest amount. It's like $50 or something.
So let me ask a question. You seem to emphasize, and certainly like a lot of traditions emphasize, the initiatic aspect of I don't know, the esoteric journey or studies. And you just said that there is no initiatic aspect. Do you feel that you're able to achieve those same kinds of breakthroughs for people without having those
If
kind
you
of
do the right practices, you'll have the inner initiation. Any exterior initiation is just a symbolic journey indicating to you the path of awakening. Now, sometimes if you have a very good initiator or initiatrix, and if you have a very good initiation team, if it's such as needed, a transfer of energy and a temporary awakening can be instilled by them. Okay, that is possible, and it can happen. However, that requires the right people. So if you're not in a position where you're going to go out and meet those people, then what are you going to do? You've got to practice. So you have to practice in the best way possible, which is to get you to inner awakening, which is the goal anyhow. The exterior practice is just a way to keep you moving to the inner awakening, that inner initiation, we call it.
Right.
So it is not contradictory. I
Okay.
mean, if we, if possible, if we had the resources, would it be possible to put on some initiatic potential? Sure, but even that's tricky because of the individuals that you're working with. It's a small group thing at most. It's not a large group. I mean, I remember my great uncle. He was the first. I was still very young when he told this story, and I'd heard it from others later on too. I mean, some people get in these environments and they can't withstand the psychic pressure because it's so rarefied. It's not often, but it does happen. And then the responsibility for that effect is on the initiator or the initiation or the group. So it's, again, this is a tricky relationship, whereas at least we are offering you solid material, solid practices, and as much support as we possibly can in what I call a kind of a college-like framework. And that's what we have to offer. And it works well. We have a lot of folks who really enjoy it. And have written back that they've benefited greatly. I would say for anyone who's interested, the best thing to do is either to go online and get the course, or they could even just go to Amazon and order it, just the booklet, is the Liturgy of Hermes. And undertake that for the 42 days that is required, and do it to the best of your capacity, and you'll be changed. There, you can just do that. We have a free course known as Unfolding the Rose. You can sign up that for free. It's 6 hours in length. It's quite a bit of material, and that doesn't include all the downloads that are there as well. I mean, these courses are a great deal of information for anyone who wants it.
That's fantastic. And so I'm definitely interested in, I'll talk to you about that off camera at the end. But just to wrap up, and I imagine there'll be some sort of reiteration of points you made, especially at the end of part one, but also a little bit there earlier in here in part two. What would you say, given, like, I think it is hard to dismiss, and I don't hear you to be dismissive of this, but I think it's hard to dismiss that the world's clearly in a state of some kind of crisis right now. There's clearly some kind of change occurring. I'm of the personal belief, and we don't have to agree on this, that things work in a cyclical nature, and that there's an Indian scholar on Graham Hancock's website, and I always forget his name because it's an Indian name, and so it's foreign and more difficult to stick in my head. But he's of the opinion, and I tend to agree, that we're coming up on the end of the Kali Yuga, so this age of extreme materialism and duality, and just sort of like the more negative aspects of humanity are running rampant, and that we're moving cyclically into the Dwapara Yuga, the Bronze Age, to where things will be more elevated than they have been. But as is the nature of these kinds of phase shifts, there's a great deal of chaos. There's a great deal of instability. You talked about how that people should be careful of magical practices because of the fact that it's inherently destabilizing, because you're looking for change, right? And whenever you're looking for change, you have to destabilize the current paradigm. There's clearly people who are trying to move things in a more dystopian direction, if you will. I also believe that there's a countervailing force that I believe will emerge successfully and victorious, of moving in this more, not perfect, not utopian, but a more harmonious era than what we've been currently living in. And so I guess I have a twofold question. One, do you believe that there is a significant change underway? Do you think that it can be positive? And if so, and hopefully it's so. What would you leave the audience with on ways that they can help to tilt those scales in the direction of things emerging as better? And I realize that's a very complicated question.
Well, let me answer it.
Want.
The notion of the Kali Yuga I've mentioned in several essays, and because it creates a context for discussion, just as Steiner's Ahriman Lucifer model, which is the model, it's not reality, it's a way of understanding reality, presents a very good model. It's a way we can talk about things, just as the word egregore gives us a way to talk about things. So this notion of the Kali Yuga gives us a way to talk about things, which there are many different ideas about what the Kali Yuga is and how long it is. But if we look at some of the writings on it, there is a theory that it is coming to an end, or a sub-cycle of it is coming to an end. And that's an important point too. A sub-cycle is coming to an end. And that next sub-cycle that comes after it will be, of course, more beneficial. However, it is not a pleasant ride.
Right.
And this is very important here. There are no guarantees. Okay. This is our karma, our habits. What are our habits? What is the direction they're pushing us in? You know, there's one Tibetan Buddhist notion that the inhabitants of this planet came from another planet, a planet that was destroyed. And there's another, you see that idea appearing in different schools of thought. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. What it tells us is that we as human beings have to make the decision that we cannot expect. You know, the gods help those who help themselves. It's that simple. So if we're not going to step up to the plate and generate the goodwill, the generosity, the helpfulness, and make the sacrifices of time, talent, and treasure, yes, it's going to cost you money. You know, these spiritual traditions live in the world in which they exist. I just posted an essay on that about Buddha and the world in which he lived, and how he was really dependent upon and trapped in many ways by the patronage system, or the world patronage system. That hasn't changed. Okay, so whether it's looking at Patreon accounts or other things, these things mean total engagement. It is a lifestyle, a vision, a philosophical view, and it is a commitment to your well-being first and foremost, and from that, the ability to be the well-being of others. Because if you're not well, you can't help others. You can only help others to the degree you can help yourself. It's that simple.
Absolutely.
Okay. So this is why there's so much emphasis on the personal, and then letting it move out, letting it ripple out, and actively seeking it. So again, if the world is, again, in a dangerous and precarious place, it has been there before, it will probably be there again. But it is up to us not to leave. It is too important a problem to be left in the hands of politicians.
Absolutely.
But that means you have to step up and say, will I be engaged? And how will I be engaged? Will I be the politician? You know, when there was this defund the police movement a few years ago, and of course, I've talked to several police chiefs since then about their problems in getting staff and what it's costing. It's amazing what cops are getting paid now because people don't want to do it. I said, okay, now here's your chance. You don't like what you see as abuse or corruption in the police, go join. So let me be very clear. The Kali Yuga is a put up or shut up moment. And I tell that to everyone all the time. It's not a throw up your hands and expect to be rescued.
Yeah.
Not going to happen. But it also doesn't mean you go down the rabbit hole and talk about dark lords and all this other stuff. It means you get your life together and you be an example to others of what sanity can be.
Yes.
Because spirituality, enlightenment, is ultimately sanity.
Mm.
So I leave you with that.
Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you, Mark, so much. This has been amazing and wonderful. I really appreciate the wisdom, especially you've shared, the panacea, if you will, of taking control of your own life, doing that inner work, and letting it emanate and ripple out through it. I'm going to include links to all of
Thank you.
Mark's work below. Again, if you're interested in the subject, especially of part one, and what inspired and allowed this interview to take place, Mark's book, Egregores, the Occult Entities That Watch Over Human Destiny, I highly recommend it. It's a brilliant work. I think it is just so important. But ultimately, I think what Mark has touched on there in his final closing share there was it's really the takeaway from these two episodes. And I really want to emphasize how important it is that everybody start to do that inner work and then let that ripple outward. There's I forget the exact Sanskrit words for it, but there's a Sanskrit saying of being rooted in being, perform action.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that rooted in being part is actually takes more effort than the perform action part. And so thank you so much, Mark, for coming on. And thank you so much, audience, for watching. And if you made it this far,
You're
please
welcome.
like and subscribe. And please do go check out all of Mark's incredible work. And we'll go ahead and end there. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.